So, hi Brit, it's a huge honor to have you here and a great pleasure to have you here in Zurich, almost. And hello to the happy few in the audience here at Literaturhaus Zürich. Hello everyone in the stream, and hello to the students and Anna Sobral who are going to have this conversation with you today. My name is Gesa Schneider. I'm the director of Literaturhaus Zürich, and we are going to talk about The Vanishing Half. The book came out in June this year and has been on the New York Times bestseller list since then. And the German came out in September this year. Der Titel ist Die verschwindende Hälfte im Rowohlt Verlag and has been translated by Isabel Bogdan und Robin Detje. I read this book this summer and I really loved it. I loved the way it tells a very complex tale of belonging, of longing, of female empowerment, of siblings, and of the fundamental questions around representation. And I particularly loved Jude, one of the daughters in the novel. And now I'd like to pass the microphone to Anna Sobral. She is professor for English literature at the University of Zurich and is having a class this semester where your book is part of the syllabus, and she's going to have this conversation with you and her students. So I'm off.
Thank you.
Good evening, Brit. I'm
Hi.
Anna. Hi, or good morning or good day to you. It's a bit early where you're at, right? Very nice to see you, and welcome to our virtual world. These are my students, all
Thank you. Hi, everybody.
appearing. I will just tell you a bit about what we're doing in the seminars. This is actually a combination of students from several seminars and students who have been studying with me for the past years. And we have always covered a lot of African American literature. And so out of that, of course, the interest has grown in the English department about this issue. And we have always spent a lot of time talking about questions of race and identity. And so your book fits beautifully into the kinds of discussions that we've had. So it's a great pleasure to have this opportunity of having this occasion for all of us to talk to you at the same time. And the way we've arranged this is that basically each one of us gets to ask you a question. And so you'll always have a different person speaking to you. Yeah. Maybe just very, very briefly, for those who are watching the stream and have not had the occasion to read your book that came out this year, The Vanishing Half, which is your second novel. But I feel there's a connection between this novel and The Mothers that you published in 2016 with, stories of families, of secrets that haunt you from the past to the present, of escaping and returning. There's a lot of those themes that I think connect these two novels. The Vanishing Half is in many ways, I would say, a classic story of passing. Right, and fits also into that tradition of novels about passing, and we are going to deal with some of them in our course, going all the way back to, oh my God, and now I've forgotten the name of the book, Passing, the famous novel, of course.
Sure.
And so we are very much dealing with this topic, and in this novel you have that interesting aspect in The Vanishing Half, as the title already says. You've got two sisters who decide to lead very different lives that are profoundly connected with racial identity, and the decisions they make then kind of affect also the next generation, and that decision itself was affected by the preceding generation. So I think it's a very strong story of families and how belonging in family and society are entangled. But maybe to start the discussion, we are going to then go into the twins and their daughters and other characters in the novel. But maybe to start also, again, for an audience that might not have had the chance to read the novel yet and might not be familiar with the phenomenon of passing. It's such a US American specific phenomenon. Can you maybe, from your perspective also, as an African American author, explain to us what passing means to you and why you decided to make this the core of your novel?
Sure. Well, yeah, thanks for having me. Thank you for everybody watching. Yeah, I mean, I think, I don't know that I set out really to write a book about passing, but it was something that became a really interesting idea to explore when I started to think about the idea of this town really that's at the center of the book. It's a town of light-skinned Black people who are obsessed with getting lighter. And from there, I started to think about this question of twin sisters and one who decides to live as white and one who decides to live as Black. So I think it's an inherently really interesting topic of passing. It speaks to, I think, both the absurdity of race, the sort of tragic implications of race or racism. It speaks to kind of the determinism of race. It speaks to a lot of that, I think, in an interesting way. So yeah, I wanted to think about some of these passing stories that you just mentioned that your class will tackle. I wanted to kind of be in conversation with some of those books, but I also wanted to write about passing from my perspective as a 21st century writer. And what does it mean to even think about passing in a world where if we assume that identity is fluid, what does it mean to pass? That, to me, that was kind of a different question than some of the earlier texts were asking about passing.
Mm-hmm. Can you, maybe there, just to continue for a moment, can you tell us one way or some ways in which it's different? Because it is a continual concern in the United States. What would you say changed significantly for you in the 21st century about passing?
I think it's that idea of fluidity. The idea, really, like, when I think about the idea of these twins, and particularly this town, Mallard, the town itself is kind of this town that exists in this space between Blackness and whiteness. And at the time in which this town is existing, that is considered very novel. I don't know that we would say that's novel now. There are lots of people who exist in that space and lots of other spaces of multiculturalism and multiracialism. We have a language for that now, versus during the time in which this town is existing. It's kind of strange that these people are neither Black and they're neither white, and that's kind of an unusual thing. I just don't think that's as unusual anymore. I think that we have a language for multiculturalism that really complicates those questions of passing and race, that often rely on having these strict boundaries between races, and I don't think those boundaries exist in the same way anymore. And I think also the idea that maybe not, I guess we don't all believe this, I shouldn't say we, but the idea that I think it's at least a more common belief that a lot of these categories of identity are both like not clear, they're not obvious, they're not necessarily stable. Yeah. The idea that you can just tell somebody is a certain race because you look at them. I think that that's something that is challenged more now, perhaps. So I just think that the general understanding of identity, and particularly when it comes to race, I just think it's a bit more complicated, and that our language has become a bit more complicated, which I think is sort of challenges some of these ideas within the book, because the book is operating within, a Jim Crow system. That's a system of binaries. That system does not allow for this third option. And now, we now have a language for being like, yeah, there are people who are neither Black nor white, and who are both, and et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. These are all topics that I think we also want to kind of dive into, also the different ways of treating appearances and what's behind them, and performance of identity. Those were definitely things that we talked about as a group. But again, thinking also of the audience out there that might not have yet had the chance to read the book, we thought this actually would be a good occasion if you wouldn't mind sharing with us the opening of the novel, and then we would actually like to discuss it with you, so we can just have that opportunity.
Sure. Yeah, I'll just read from the first section of the book. The morning one of the lost twins returned to Mallard, Lou LeBond ran to the diner to break the news. And even now, many years later, everyone remembers the shock of sweaty Lou pushing through the glass doors, chest heaving, neckline darkened with his own effort. The barely awake customers clamored around him, 10 or so, although more would lie and say that they'd been there too, if only to pretend that this once they'd witnessed something truly exciting. In that little farm town, nothing surprising ever happened, not since the Vignes twins had disappeared. But that morning in April 1968, on his way to work, Lou spotted Desiree Vignes walking along Partridge Road, carrying a small leather suitcase. She looked exactly the same as when she'd left at 16, still light, her skin the color of sand, barely wet, her hipless body reminding him of a branch caught in a strong breeze. She was hurrying, her head bent, and Lou paused here, a bit of a showman. She was holding the hand of a girl, 7 or 8, and black as tar. Blue black, he said, like she'd flown direct from Africa. Lou's egg house splintered into a dozen different conversations. The line cook wondered if it had been Desiree after all, since Lou was turning 60 in May and still too vain to wear his eyeglasses. The waitress said that it had to be. Even a blind man could spot a Vignes girl, and it certainly couldn't have been that other one. The diners, abandoning grits and eggs on the counter, didn't care about that Vignes foolishness. Who on earth was the dark child? Could she possibly be Desiree's? Well, who else could it be? Lou said. He grabbed a handful of napkins from the dispenser, dabbing his damp forehead. Maybe it's an orphan that got took in. I just don't see how nothing that black could have come out Desiree. Desiree seemed like the type to take in no orphan to you. Of course she didn't. She was a selfish girl. If they remembered anything about Desiree, it was that, and most didn't recall much more. The twins had been gone 14 years, nearly as long as anyone had ever known them. Vanished from bed after the Father's Day dance while their mother slept right down the hall. One morning, the twins crowded in front of their bathroom mirror, 4 identical girls fussing with their hair. The next, the bed was empty, covers pulled back like any other day, taut when Stella made it, crumpled when Desiree did. The town spent all morning searching for them, calling their names through the woods, wondering stupidly if they had been taken. Their disappearance seemed as sudden as the rapture, all of Mallard the sinners left behind. Naturally, the truth was neither sinister nor mystical. The twins soon surfaced in New Orleans, selfish girls running from responsibility. They wouldn't stay away long. City living would tire them out. They'd run out of money and gall and come sniffling back to their mother's porch. But they never returned again. Instead, after a year, twins scattered, their lives splitting as evenly as their shared egg. Stella became white, and Desiree married the darkest man she could find. Now she was back, Lord knows why. Homesick, maybe. Missing her mother after all those years, or wanting to flaunt that dark daughter of hers. In Mallard, nobody married dark. Nobody left either, but Desiree had already done that. Marrying a dark man and dragging his blue-black child all over town was one step too far. In Lou's egg house, the crowd dissolved, the line cook snapping on his hairnet, the waitress counting nickels on the table, men in coveralls gulping coffee before heading out to the refinery. Lou leaned against the smudged window, staring out at the road. He ought to call Adele Vignes. Didn't seem right for her to be ambushed by her own daughter, not after everything she'd already been through. Now Desiree and that dark child, Lord, he reached for the phone. You think they fixin' to stay? The line cook asked. Who knows? She sure seemed in a hurry, though, Lou said. Wonder what she hurrying to. Looked right past me, didn't wave or nothing. Uppity. And what reason she got to be uppity? Lord, Lou said. I never seen a child that black before.
Thank you, Brit. I think I'm going to pass the word to my students because there's so many questions, and I'm going to pass it on to Nastasia first of all.
Hi there. Thank you for joining us. It's so nice to have you. I really enjoyed reading your book. You've been mentioning this town of Mallard, which I found extremely interesting and, to be honest, a little unnerving as I was reading through it. So when reading about the light-skinned people in Mallard and how, as the text says, they would never be accepted as white, I was reminded of the one drop rule that makes someone Black even if they only have one drop of Black blood. Yet, despite this rule, there is still this obsession with whiteness in the town, even though, like the twins' father, they can still be killed for being Black. At the beginning, and then again near the end of the novel, you write that Mallard is more idea than place. What I'm wondering is, if their likeness doesn't actually change their position as Black or protect them, then what is the idea that Mallard represents? And why did you decide to embody it in the physical space of the town?
Thank you. Those are all really good questions. I think maybe I will answer them backwards. So I think, well, maybe not, but I think as far as the idea that Mallard represents, I think that kind of inherent, the thing that you are trying to make logical sense of is really what to me was really interesting about the idea of this place. Because I think that you often can encounter these sort of light-skinned communities. For example, if you've ever read Negroland by Margot Jefferson, which is about these light-skinned Black communities in Chicago. And when you read Negroland, you're like, okay, these are light-skinned Black people, but they are also doctors, they are lawyers, they are like achieving some level of affluence and upward mobility. And that is one of the rewards that their lightness gives them. Or if you think about a character who is passing for white in the way that Stella does, her lightness then becomes like a currency that she can exchange for something. What was really interesting to me about Mallard is the fact that what you just pointed out, which is that there is no tangible reward for this. This is a community that is seeking lightness, and that in itself is the end. That is what they are trying to achieve. And there's nothing else that it gives them besides this is the value and this is what we care about. And to me, I do find something about that to be even more, I think, unnerving, as you said, than people who think that, this is a currency I can trade for something, because this is the currency in Mallard, is just lightness. That's what they're hoping to gain. So for me, I found that to be more disturbing and also kind of more interesting, because what I wanted to think about this book was, how can I push these ideas to their extreme, push these ideas about color to their most extreme version. And one way of doing that was thinking about characters who are pursuing lightness for its own sake. Even though it doesn't bring them any tangible reward, that is the reward. So that was one of the ways of pushing that idea to sort of its most extreme edge. And then the other ideas, as you brought up at the end, was thinking about locating this in a specific place. Because colorism is obviously a global phenomenon, but I wanted to think about, what does colorism look like occupying in this one specific place, played out in this very extreme way. And part of that, I think, allowed me to think about the absurdity of it. I always thought of that as I was working on this book. I think that there is inherent absurdity in thinking about any type of racial categorization or anything. There's, a moment when Stella asks, what makes this person white and what makes us not white? And to me, I'm like, yes, that is one of the questions I'm most interested in, because I've got an aunt in Louisiana who, is pale skinned with red hair, and, why is she Black? So to me, like, there's so much inherent sort of absurdity and this sort of lack of logic to these rules of race. But I wanted to explore that, I think, in thinking about Mallard and thinking about the rules and conventions of Mallard, because they don't make a logical sense. But within the kind of hierarchy of this town, this is the logic there. This is how it operates there. And what then does this very twisted logic of Mallard do to the people who live there? in the way that the twisted logic of race does something to all of us who operate within its rules. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll pass it on to Monica.
Yes, hello. Actually, thank you also for choosing the opening passage to read, because I was really interested in that. I thought it was such an interesting choice of scene for the beginning. So really my question would also be more or less very basically, why did you choose this scene? And particularly I was thinking it is obviously set in a time before the main time where then later, well, the most part of the story takes place. And we get this point of view from Lou, so it's obviously an outside point of view, and also the scene from this point of view is the first one that introduces us to this, I'd say, mysterious backstory or background of the sisters, and then obviously also their children. So I think possibly part of it is already the colorism that you have now addressed, but maybe just in general, why did you choose this particular scene, and how do you think this is an entrance point for us into the setting, the world, and the themes and characters?
Thank you. I mean, I think first I'll say I always knew that this was where the book was going to start. That was like one thing that did not change as I worked on the book over however many years. And I think part of that is just, one thing that just for me as a reader, I love books about women mysteriously returning from afar under like strange circumstances, and nobody really knows what they were doing or why they're back. That's just like a type of literature I enjoy. So I think that there is a part of me that thought about that. I think about a book like Their Eyes Were Watching God, which begins with a mysterious return. And I think there was a part of me just as a reader that finds that appealing. But also, I think more specifically, I think that the opening section of the book introduces you to Mallard as I always thought of it, which was that it's both it's a place, it's an idea, and it's a problem. And I think that the opening introduces you to those different elements. It introduces you, I think, in a way that allows you to kind of see inside of it and outside of it. I think that can be a really helpful way of kind of entering a world. Because you see kind of the insiders of the community that's gathered at this diner, and you see Lou, who's an insider, and you see Desiree and her daughter, Desiree, who's kind of an outsider because she's been gone, but certainly not as much of an outsider as her daughter is, and you see the way her daughter is treated. And I think also seeing the reaction of this town to Jude very clearly tells you what the values of this town is. And also sets up the fact that this is going to be a problem going forward. Like her presence in this town is going to cause a problem. So I think it does a lot of the different things that I am usually looking for an opening to do, which is just like establishing when and where we are and what's happening, and giving me a hint at the trouble that is to come. I think it does a lot of those things. But I think also I think part of me is just as a reader, I love a story like that opens and kind of announces itself as a story that begins with somebody mysteriously returning. And I love, I guess Sula doesn't begin that way, but Sula also has a mysterious kind of return. So yeah, I love books that do that. I think I wanted to kind of try my hand at that too.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to Leah.
Hi, Brit. Thank you so much for talking to us and for your book. I read it in 2 days. I was so fascinated. The multiple female perspectives, and I really enjoyed it. And I think my question, we already talked about it a bit, because I wanted to ask you about the specific time setting, why you're traveling back in time and working on that part of American history. So you're starting in the Jim Crow area where there were still these racial segregation laws, and you're then moving until the late 80s. And the novel is also structured into these time frames. I was just interested why you choose to put this topic of passing and of identity in that time, and how do you relate it to nowadays? Or why do you still think that working through these issues during that time is important for an audience to read now? Is it a time of, is it a way of you to kind of work on cultural memory also, or yeah? And you touched upon it already, so I'm sorry for being maybe, but just if there is, yeah, another kind of thought you have about the time.
Sure, thank you.
Yeah.
So for the first part of your question, I remember when I was working on this book and I was talking to somebody about it and telling them a little bit about the book and when it was set, and her reaction was like, oh no, you set that like way too late in time. Like that's not when passing stories happen. Mm-hmm. And I kind of understood that impulse because it's true that like most of our really iconic passing stories, you know, take place much earlier. And starting it in 1968 is kind of unusual within that, that tradition. But I think for me, I was really interested in thinking about what that slightly more contemporary version of passing looks like, because I think particularly that kind of civil rights era is such an interesting time as far as the rules and kind of rituals of race being challenged and rewritten in certain ways. So for a character like Stella, you know, what does it mean for Stella to pass at a time in which the rules of Blackness and the rules of whiteness are changing? Mm-hmm. And I think in the book, you see her that she's constantly doing it wrong, that she's constantly screwing up because she, you know, experiences whiteness in one way as a child growing up in the Jim Crow South as a Black child. And then when she passes, you know, now she's living in this, you know, ritzy neighborhood in LA, and the way in which she is performing whiteness is inappropriate there because, you know, they, like her husband is kind of embarrassed and he thinks that she's kind of trashy. And then later you see that her daughter, you know, has a Black boyfriend and Stella's like objecting to it. And there's like a tension there, and the ways in which like the appropriate way in which she can be white is constantly changing around her, and she's always a step or two behind. Mm-hmm. And there was something so interesting to me about, I think specifically just that time period of going from, you know, a swing of years of, and obviously not everybody went through this evolution, but like, yeah, the idea that like conceivably she could go from being a child terrorized by white people and her daughter is a white girl who's dating a Black man in a matter of years. And that's like a swing that you can go on. And so to me, there was something so dramatic about just that time period and what it meant to move between identities at a time in which the national identity was changing so much. I think for the second part of your question, which was about kind of, I guess, a contemporary reading or writing into that. Yeah, I think, you know, I didn't think too much about that when I was working on the book about how it would be read now or what it said about now. But I think that it felt fruitful to kind of write into the past and thinking about these questions of identity and the instability of identity. And to me, that was the thing that felt most pressing and urgent was looking at, you know, it's like when I think about some of these conversations about identity, I'm always like, these are conversations that often, you know, have been happening for, like, there's a way in which I think sometimes we act like these are new conversations. But it's like, these are conversations that have been happening. These are ways that people have been living. Maybe people were not as aware of it, or you did not see kind of, you know, like, yeah, there's always been multiracial people. There just maybe was not that word, multiracial, you know? So I think thinking about the past and thinking about the instability of these categories, even then, a time in which we like to think that those categories were very stable. I think it gave me kind of maybe a newer lens into thinking about identity today and kind of and thinking about the way in which it operates now. So I think it's interesting to me that people are reading it into this contemporary moment, because I didn't imagine that it would be read that way, and of course said it 50 years ago or whatever. But I think it's perhaps like those questions that are leading people to think about the book in this book.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, I will pass it on to Julia.
So hi, lovely
Hi.
to meet you. It's such a delight to meet you, and I really enjoyed the book. And so my question, or one of the aspects that I thought were really interesting, were so the intergenerational dynamics, or also like the mother-daughter relationships. And what I'm kind of interested in, so also kind of this idea, for example, the resentment that Kennedy feels about Stella because she was lying to her, and how kind of lying about Stella lying about her own identity also in a way influences Kennedy's identity at the same time, and in that sense also how kind of this inheritance of internalized racism or colorism, and how kind of the next generation can deal with it. And my question kind of was kind of when you were writing these relationships, what were your thoughts on this kind of intergenerational racial traumas that are kind of given from one generation to another, and also kind of how the younger generation deals with this kind of inheritance. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. I think that was one of the big questions on my mind, because I think that's one of the things that's just so strange and hard often about just being a person, which is that it's like we inherit so much from our parents, mm-hmm. and we often have no way of understanding it. We just are given it. And I think that Kennedy and Stella is a very extreme example of that. The twins, they inherit the trauma of their father's lynching, but also Kennedy inherits the trauma of that from her mother and has no context for it. So I wanted to think about that, of kind of how that pain and how those experiences can be inherited, and if it's possible for us to kind of either move toward understanding them or also free ourselves from them. Because I think Kennedy's journey is one towards trying to understand her mother more. Jude inherits, I think, so much of the trauma of growing up in Mallard and the violence of colorism that she experiences there, and that is kind of, just bred in that place. That's what Jude inherits, and I think her journey is less towards understanding her inheritance and more towards trying to break herself free of it. So I think that both of those daughters have kind of different journeys. But I wanted to think about, the complexities of these mother-daughter relationships. And particularly, is it possible to kind of rid ourselves or free ourselves of what we have inherited? Because to me, that was, I think, one of the just hardest realities of realizing that you inherit things from your family, but you may never even, in the case of Kennedy, she never know, she doesn't learn the story of what happens to her mother's father until much later, and then she kind of can piece together why her mother is the way she is to some extent. So I found that to be a really heartbreaking thing that I wanted to explore a bit.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm moving on to Andrin.
Hi, Brit. Thank you for joining us. Your answer was actually the perfect prompt for what I was hoping to ask, because I'm curious about a bit more the personal process of writing and the relationship, not necessarily between parents and children, but between author and characters. Because I think also characters, they always inherit a certain part from you and come from a certain personal experience and things that are very familiar, and then others that break away and move away from that. And so I was wondering, from all the different viewpoints, characters that you write about and all the different mindsets that you had to empathize with, I guess, to create all of these characters on the page, which one was the most difficult? Or what part did you struggle the most to simulate in a believable way?
Yeah, thank you. That's a good question. I think, you know, it's tough. I think that the most difficult to write, I think, is also one who has perhaps inherited the most from me, which is Stella. I think that Stella's her kind of impulses and her personality, I think, align with mine certainly more than Desiree. She sounds very introverted. She's kind of guarded, and she's, you know, brainy and ambitious. I think that she has there's a lot of me in her. So, but I think that often, and perhaps like, maybe it makes sense that those can be the toughest characters to write, because it can be hard to both see yourself clearly and also face yourself. So maybe that's a reason why Stella was really hard to kind of get down. But I found Stella really challenging. I think her personality is very, it's that guardedness that's hard to kind of push through, even as a writer. And also Stella does make choices that I think are difficult to empathize with sometimes, or maybe more difficult to empathize with than some of the other characters. So she was challenging for me. And I think a character that is truly nothing like me, but who I really did enjoy writing and felt came to me fairly naturally. I think two characters, I think Early and Kennedy, who were the characters who were probably least like me, but the characters I really enjoyed writing and felt like they came to me pretty naturally. So those are the characters I think have been inherited the least from me. But yeah, I think there can be something, sometimes I think writing a character who is somewhat similar to yourself can be, it can feel easier. But other times it's like having these characters where you're completely throwing your voice and just channeling something else that can often be a bit freer in a way. And maybe that's what gave me an ease to thinking about those characters.
It's so fascinating. Thank you.
Thanks.
I'm going to continue here with Sarah, actually, so you can go.
Hi, it's so nice to meet you in this particular peculiar setting. So my question touches on a few things that have been mentioned before and wants to take them a bit in a different direction. So we have on the one hand talked a lot about performance and identity, and on the other hand also of how your characters in very interesting ways kind of mirror and contrast each other. And one character that has not been mentioned so far, who's also very central to this novel, is the character of Reese. To those listening who might not have read the novel, Reese is a young transgender man who is the boyfriend of Desiree's daughter, Jude. And I found it very interesting how this character in many ways also serves as a contrast to Stella, in that Stella has to take up a performance and loses herself in the process. And Reese kind of lets go of a performance of something that he is not in order to find his own identity. And through this character, I wanted to ask you, on the one hand, how you found this character and how you realized that he was necessary to the story you wanted to tell. How he also kind of opens up questions of gender in relation to race that is constructed in this novel and through society, the way he constructs race, how it also constructs gender in a way and how these two might interact. So that would be my very broad question. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, first, yeah, I totally, I really love your reading on Reese. That was how I thought of him, was that he was a counterpoint to Stella in that way that you described. I think sort of thinking of how I thought of him, I mean, first, just as a character, he was, I loved the idea of Jude falling in love and just finding community outside of the violence of Mallard that she's experienced. So Reese was a character who I loved in that role, and thinking about that relationship of these two characters who have both experienced a lot of pain and shame surrounding their bodies specifically, and finding love with each other. That was something that I wanted to really explore. But I think thematically, as you said, I think that he spoke to a lot of the thematics of the book. For one, the way in which he counterpointed Stella, like you just described, but also I think he is a character who does reinvent himself, and a character, and I wanted to also think about how Reese's story can at least, I think that before you meet Reese, there's a feeling that the type of change or that Stella undergoes, or any type of dramatic change like that, is bad, or, you know. And I think with Reese, I think you see kind of a more complex idea of reinvention. You see that, you know, Reese also leaves his family behind for the sake of his survival. And like, it was a good thing for him to do that. You know, he is somebody who finds liberation through his new world, in the way that Stella does not feel liberated at all. You know, she feels quite trapped in this kind of prison that she's created for herself. And Reese instead feels free for the first time. So there was a lot of ways in which I thought that Reese really counterpointed Stella and kind of made the thematics of change in the book feel a little bit more complex. And as far as this question of gender, I think it was interesting for me for a few reasons. One was that I think when I read Passing by Nell Larson in college, I remember the professor talking about how often passing narratives involve multiple levels of passing. It's often not just kind of one category. So that was one thing that I thought about just kind of off the bat, is like, yeah, this book is something that can involve these different levels of passing for these characters. And thinking about something like gender felt like a natural way to kind of do that. But I also, I wanted to write in a way that wasn't conflating the experiences of gender and race, or Stella and Reese. I didn't want to make it seem like those things were the same. Excuse me, but I did want to think about, the complexities of gender, which I think can be something that people, I think, can still be very reductive over and kind of limited in their understanding of that. As I was saying, how I believe that we're like moving towards a more sort of complex idea of talking about racial identity. I hope that we're moving towards that with gender, but I think even more slowly with gender. So I wanted to kind of bring in that conversation and also, again, particularly just explore the idea that these are not new conversations. You know, and thinking about Reese, I was reading memoirs by transgender men in, you know, the 60s and 70s. So the idea that like these are new conversations that we're having around gender, they're not new at all. I wanted to kind of explore that a bit, I think, with the role of Reese.
Thank you. I think Inora can take over from here very well.
Yes. Hi. I've actually been spending a lot of time with your book, as you can see.
Whoa!
But I tried to make this one question. So we've already talked about this quite a lot, the performance, which is a major theme in the novel. And it seems like every major character engages in some kind of performance. Stella performs whiteness, and Desiree also performs in a school play and imitates Stella. And also Kennedy becomes an actress, and Jude, even to a degree, can be said to perform a different identity when she moves to LA. And also the minor characters, for example, we talked just about Reese, who doesn't necessarily perform gender, or maybe yes, but he passes a cisgender sometimes, which might be some kind of performance. And his friend Barry, who performs his femininity as a drag queen, Bianca. So it seems like the novel kind of portrays identity and maybe life itself as a performance. So I was wondering what your thoughts are about this and how you thought about performance while writing the novel, and maybe how it influenced or it was influenced by the different characters.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that was one of the big themes that I wanted to think about, was that nature of performance. I think for one question that became really interesting to me was thinking about moments when the performance becomes real, because that was something that I was kind of encountering as I was reading about sort of in advance of writing the book. For example, there was a book that I read that was about faking your death. And there was like an anecdote in the book about somebody who had faked their death, who was exposed later. And when they were confronted, they just kind of refused to admit, okay, you got me. They just kept doubling and tripling down. And it was almost as if they had fully believed that this new identity they had been living for the past 20 years was the only life they had ever known. And there was something so harrowing about that to me, and fascinating, of what does it mean to perform something so much that becomes the real life, and the real life that you've been living becomes the performance. So I wanted to think about moments where all of that kind of twists around itself and kind of inverts. So that was one entry point that was interesting to me. I think I was also interested in these performances that are fleeting versus these ones that are more permanent. Because like you said, there are characters like Barry, who's a drag queen, and Kennedy, who's an actor. And, there are people who get up on a stage and perform and then leave the stage. That's very different than what Stella is doing, where the whole world is her stage. So I wanted to think about that too, because I think that there's a way in which that fleeting and temporary performance, again, can sometimes be more real than the real life that you are living otherwise. And what is that experience like? And that was also kind of strange. So yeah, I was interested in that, and thinking about what does identity mean? Like, how real are any of these categories of identity if you can perform them? So how real is race if Stella can walk into a room as a Black woman and leave as a white woman? So what does race mean then, and how real is it? And yet the fact that she leaves as a white woman, that's what allows her to have a job, and that job will allow her to pay her rent, and that rent will keep her from, paying her rent. They'll keep her off the streets, and it has all these real implications. And yet at the same time, it's so flimsy that she's able to perform it because somebody mistakens her for being white. To me, there was something really fraught and complicated in that tension between the performative and also like that very real consequence of these identities. The consequence of your gender or your race or whatever has real life consequences. But if you can perform them, how real are those categories? How fixed are they? And if they're not fixed, then what does it mean that we have things like sexism and racism, et cetera, et cetera?
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll pass it on to Matteo.
And yes, also hello from me. Given that we actually have more time left than I calculated, I can actually ask two questions without having to jumble them together into one composite one. So Enora already mentioned this scene where Desiree performs in a play, and there, of course, you have some intertextual reference when you mention Romeo and Juliet, and also in this conversation that we've been having this evening, you've mentioned a number of books that you were reading that kind of influenced you. Also, you need to let us know the name of the book about the guy or the person who faked their death. Yes, you mentioned a number of things, and I was wondering, firstly, maybe more generally, although you've touched on that already, how or what is the intertextual influence that you were under while writing? And also, how do you position yourself as a writer towards other texts, and how do you think this becomes apparent in your writing?
Okay, well, the first question, the death faking book is called Playing Dead by Elizabeth Greenwood. It's really fun, and it's the writer kind of sets out to discover, could she get away with it? Like, could she figure out how to convincingly fake her death? Because as you might imagine, most people who try to do it are eventually caught. Like, it's not, but at the same time, like, we have no way of knowing the people who have successfully done it, because if you have successfully faked your death, nobody will know that you did it. So it's a really fun book as she's trying to explore, like, how can she do it? But I found that weirdly helpful. The second question was about kind of intertextual references. I think I don't even know if I thought about it in that way, but I guess thinking about the books that I felt like this was in conversation with, I think something like Passing by Nell Larson was certainly one that came to mind. That was a book that I read in college that I think really struck me and was also particularly helpful because it is a story about a very fraught relationship between two women. They're not sisters, but they grew up together, and there's kind of that shade of sisterhood there. So that book was something that I thought about a lot. I think something like The Bluest Eye was a book that I also thought about. And really the first text that I ever encountered about passing was the film version of Imitation of Life. And that was a movie that I watched when I was a kid. And it was the first time I'd ever seen a character passing and didn't really know what it was or why you would do that. But I think it's become kind of the most, certainly on film, I think the most iconic kind of American film on passing. But again, it's like a story about passing that's about mothers and daughters. So I think that was something that also was helpful. And your third question was about how could you repeat your third question?
Yeah, how do you think this is reflected in your writing, or how, yeah.
Yeah. That's an interesting question. Yeah, I don't know how that's reflected in my writing. I think it's hard to know because I think all of these things that you consume and experience make their way somehow into it, So, like I said, like the death faking book that I just happened to read, because I think I saw people talking about it on Twitter or something. And I happened to read it, and it gave me like this insight into Stella's psychology and what it must be like. It gave me a new lens, a new way of thinking about racial passing that kind of divorced it from the question of race and just made me think about, the idea of killing off your former self and assuming a new life. And that gave me a really fresh way to think about passing. That was not necessarily as loaded with the kind of weight of history. It gave me a really fresh way to do it. So that was something that trickled into it. There was a character, one of the people she talks in that book is like a bounty hunter. And that also made me think about Early and think about his role and how someone who finds missing people and how they go about finding missing people. And it was very different because obviously it was a contemporary book. So much of the bounty hunting was like Google and internet, which was very different. But that kind of mentality of somebody who's hunting for someone who's missing was something that I kind of found from there. So I don't know so much about how that positions me as a writer, but I think all of these things that I encountered and read in the process of working on this book, I think it all kind of bled into the book in some way.
Thank you, perfect. And so now, after exposing my first question as 3 questions, here comes my second question. And you've probably been asked a similar thing a number of times, so I'll be a bit more specific, but you will be the executive producer of a film adaptation or a series adaptation of your book on HBO. Can you let us know a bit more about that? And then there's the main question that we were wondering about: what is your intended audience and what are you trying to achieve by having the book adapted, and given that you have some control over that?
So for the first part of your question, we're still at the very beginning process, so I don't have any updates yet. We're just assembling, the writers because I'm not writing it myself. So we're assembling the writers and the producers and kind of getting that whole creative side together to start outlining it. It's right now, I think we're aiming for like a limited series, but we'll see what happens. It kind of depends on a lot on the direction of the writers. So that's where we are with that. As far as intended audience, I don't know. I think what I hope for this is that I hope that this project will capture the spirit of the book so that people who have read the book will enjoy it. But I also hope that it brings in people who haven't read the book, and that it can be something that could even bring in someone who doesn't think they would be interested in the book. I'm hoping that that's who we speak to. So both things. I think adaptations are hard because, so often they're disappointing if you really love a book. It's hard to really, but at the same time, I think we are living in a time where there have been a lot of really interesting adaptations, at least, that have come out on TV recently. So I'm hoping that this project will be one of those that will allow you to see the book in a new light and give you, be pleasing if you read the book and enjoyed it, but will also allow you to see the book in a new light and sort of have some ideas of expanding kind of beyond the book in some interesting ways. That's what I would hope for. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks a ton.
Thanks.
Thank you. I'm trying to get myself to be the main person, but I don't. Okay, can you see me actually? Wonderful. Yes. Now. Okay, here I am. I would like to just close with a question. I mean, we've had so many questions, and you've had to address so many interests here of a very, diverse audience of students. But one thing that I thought now, as you were talking about the adaptation to the series format, was also that one thing that I think is really important to point out about the novel, and that I found amazingly strong, is the fact that you keep switching perspectives. And so we are, for me, that was really impressive at the point at which we finally arrive at Stella. Stella kind of enters the narrative, beyond that everybody talking about her, which is also quite interesting. That's quite a bit of the let's say, first part, maybe even almost first half of the novel. And then we finally start getting closer to Stella and her perspective on why she did it, the whole passing and abandoning her past. And I thought it was such a powerful way also of helping us as readers sympathize in fact with all the characters, because we become so close to them and we see them, their ideas and their decisions from the inside. And I found that very, very powerful, particularly with Stella, though also Jude, of course, the people who have suffered more from this racism and kind of felt so oppressed by it. So my question to you, really as a closing question, and back to decisions we make, or that writers make, that changing perspectives and zooming in, let's put it this way, was this something that occurred to you early on? Is this something that you thought, I have to write it this way? Or how does it happen as a writer that it's also a very challenging thing for a writer because you have to become so close to so many characters. So how did that process happen?
Yeah, well, I knew one thing I'll say that I did. Well, maybe I knew this early on. I think one thing that kind of feeling that you described, of that sort of delay of Stella, that was something that I knew I wanted to do. I didn't want to see her right away. I didn't want her to be, I didn't want it to be like Heart of Darkness or something, where like the whole book you're waiting to see Stella. I didn't want that. I wanted her to pop up early enough so you got to spend time with her. But I wanted that feeling of delay because, again, I think you see that sister relationship from Desiree's point of view. Desiree feels so wounded and betrayed and abandoned. And you are kind of like, how could Stella do this? And it kind of raises those questions. And eventually when you see Stella's life, I think it gives you that payoff. So that was something that I did know. But as far as the other characters, it really was kind of just following which characters were interesting to me. And it's hard for me as a novelist because I'm the type of writer who wants to spend time in everybody's head. I really want to spend time with all of the characters and every character that has been mentioned. I want to write, 20 pages about them. But that would just kind of pull the book apart at its seams. So a lot of that for me was about having to kind of realize that the twins were the kind of center of the book. And every time I was getting away from that center, I had to kind of reel myself back in. But other than that, I think what I also love about novels is that it gives you that space to explore these different characters. It gives you moments where you can have digressions, and it gives you space to kind of breathe and see these different characters moving in and out of their world in a way that you can't do as much in some other mediums. So I wanted to give myself that space to have, here's a section from Reese's point of view, or there's a small section from Stella's husband's point of view, and all these other characters that you think are kind of small characters. I want to give you a little glimpse of that, because I think that that's what I enjoy as a reader, is seeing the just complex lives of all of the people who are occupying the world of the novel.
Yeah, thank you. That's, I think, precisely what comes across so beautifully. It's the complexity of life, but in this, in this way that everything flows very seamlessly, it seems, of course, from one character to the other. And it's beautiful, I think, for the reader to suddenly be shown that other perspective. We've been watching, for example, Reese from the outside, and suddenly we're in Reese's head, right? And sometimes watching the same scene. And that is, I think, a very powerful way of making us readers also close to the characters and appreciate all the characters.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Brit, for this wonderful conversation. It's been a great, opportunity, privilege to be able to talk to you so much in detail about this amazing novel. And I think we all look forward to seeing also the series adaptation, to sharing the novel with other people, and to seeing where this conversation goes.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you, everyone, for your really great questions.
Thank you. And I think we will close our chat here. Again, thank you so much, Brit. Thank you to everyone, for all the students who joined us and helped this conversation gain so many different angles. I hope that the audience out there enjoyed, and go read the book. It's worth every sentence. Have a lovely evening, everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
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 Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.